Thank you so much for joining us this morning for some, and for some evening, and for some night. And so we really appreciate everyone joining us for today's webinar. We're going to get started. Before we get started, we're just going to share some logistics. We do have interpretation on the webinar today. Interpretation is available in Khmer, and you should be able to see the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can select your preferred language for this webinar. And the languages on offer are English and France for the Khmer interpretation. So please take a moment and choose your preferred language for today's webinar. Okay. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Casey Foster. I'm the co-executive director of Partners for Dignity and Rights. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, which is the second in our series we're calling Corporate Accountability in Uncertain Times. Today, we're joined by panelists from 3 continents to discuss findings of our latest report, Checking Boxes, Cheating Workers: How Social Audit Firms Are Complicit in Labor Rights Abuses. This report deep dives into 3 case studies that examine the role of social auditing in the corporate social responsibility industry more broadly. We're at a critical moment right now. For over a decade, research and worker advocates' own testimony has repeatedly shown that these social audits fail to uncover abuses. Yet companies almost universally continue to rely on these audits and repeatedly point back to them as evidence that they're fulfilling their human rights obligations. Today, we're joined by 6 panelists to talk about 3 case studies in the report, as well as the report's findings on the auditing industry more broadly. We'll have about 30 minutes at the end for a question Q&A from our audience. We'll be putting the questions into the Q&A box as they come up. Oh, I'm sorry, you should be putting your questions. We're not putting them there for you as they come up. And again, we'll be interpreting from Khmer to English. So I'll ask our speakers to remember to slow down. And I'll ask myself to remember to slow down as well. So we are going to jump right into our conversation with our panelists. And our first panelist is Anna Canning. She's the Director of Campaigns here at Partners for Dignity and Rights, and also the report's main author. Anna, can you tell us how this report came to be and what the key findings are?
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much for being here, everyone. This report has been several years in the making, and I'm really honored to have all of you here to discuss it. Um, this report started to come together about 2 years ago as we were campaigning on 2 of the longtime outstanding wage theft cases from the early months of the pandemic. And other panelists will talk more about the details, but I was looking at the Hong Seng knitting and Hulu garment cases. And one of the things that really stood out there was the role that these supposedly independent third-party human rights consultants or social audit firms were playing. In both of these cases, they were providing these official reports and fact-finding that just contradicted all common sense, not to mention available evidence and existing investigations into the case. So, having worked at that point is for many years as a watchdog of ethical certifications, I was familiar with the existing research, which points to how social auditing routinely fails to detect even the most glaring and systemic abuses. But what these cases, and then the VK Garment case, which is also a part of this report, showed is the extent to which it's not just that these social audit firms are failing, that is, bad at doing their jobs, but that they are, as the title of the report says, actively complicit in helping companies evade accountability. So, since the report has come out a couple weeks ago, I've heard from people on multiple continents reaching out to tell me their own experiences with social auditing broadly and also the firms named in the report. And one former auditor's words to me summarizing the industry were very simply, it's a flat lie. So if everything I've heard, I mean, I think one of the takeaways from everything I heard since then is really underscored for me is the extent to which this report is a conservative account of the ways that the industry is set up to obscure rather than uncover findings. And there are a few key findings I think I'll lift up here, and other folks are going to get more into the details of the cases. But first and foremost, in the most generous interpretation, social auditing does a terrible job of interpreting workplace power imbalances and the realities of low-wage workers. And that is, of course, the most generous assessment that it is just a failure and not a deliberately convoluted argument in favor of power and the status quo. Um, there's been plenty of research emphasizing the issues of semi-announced or announced audits, audit coaching, workers' fears of retaliation. And yet, throughout this report, we see social audits continue to be conducted using flawed methodology that is known to deliver flawed results. So, although these firms are selling themselves in experts in human rights and all that, they're not actually doing proper due diligence in understanding the risks that workers face. And this is a theme throughout, but it really stands out, I would say, in the part of the report that gets into the investigations done by the firm Elevate, now LRQA, and the Fair Labor Association in the Hong Seng case. Another key finding is that conflicts of interests are really built into the social auditing model, especially when suppliers are the ones paying for the audit, because that puts the supplier in the relationship of client, and the incentive is to satisfy the client instead of uncover uncomfortable truths. And I would say the conduct of the firm Intertech in the VK Garment case is a particularly extreme example of this. Um, Another point I'd make is that transparency is really a key building block of corporate accountability and access to remedy, as is articulated in, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Yet the auditing industry, by and large, really lacks transparency. Things like the scope, the terms of the inquiry, the methodology of a social audit are often not disclosed, making it difficult for workers, advocates, investors, or the general public to understand the context of any of the findings. It's also a huge problem the way that audit reports are considered the property of the client, which is one of the key ways that those conflicts of interest in the model are put above rights holders' interests. Um, I would say, over time there has been now decades, I guess, we're in 2025, it has been decades of critique of the social auditing and certification industry. And so we see that, that field is evolving and responding to that criticism by using new language, a lot of terminology about being, beyond audits, which is one of the taglines of Impact, another of the firms named in the report. But I think what we see so far is that these pivots in terminology are not actually changing outcomes for workers. And that brings me really to the final point, which I think is the central one in some ways. All of the cases in this report are from 2020. And so far, none of the workers in them have received satisfactory remedy for the harms and abuses covered in the report. And, that brings me to the final bottom line, right? Which is all of these social audit recommendations are really just nice suggestions. Without a structure of binding agreements, there are no requirements for remediation that are like hard and fast, right? And so what we see is that in these cases, the role that audit firms have played has really served more to delay remedy than to ensure it.
Thank you for that, Anna. And as you mentioned, right, these firms are really supposed to be set up to protect abuses that workers are facing in factories. And now we want to turn and talk to some people who work with workers and workers in factories. I'm going to try to see if was Pasal able to join us? Okay, we will go to Brahm Press for our next question. Brahm, are you still with us? There you are. Thank you. Um, So, Brahm, two of the case studies in this report involve Burmese migrant workers in Thailand, which your organization, the MAP Foundation, works with regularly. Can you talk a little bit about the case of workers at the VK garment factory and the challenges that those workers face in defending their rights and the role that social auditing played in that case?
Sure. So first, you need a picture of Mesot, the area where we work. It runs along the Myanmar border, which is highly permeable and the busiest border crossing between two countries. There's a large presence of migrants. Many are undocumented or tenuously documented. And as a result, a lot of unscrupulous investors set up factories in order to take advantage of these migrants. The area has been called the Wild West of the global supply chain and a black hole for labor rights. Over the past 20 years, MAP has been working to support and empower migrants in Mesot to receive their proper labor rights. Most labor cases look the same here. Employers underpay their workers below the minimum wage, which is currently just over 10 USD for a full day's work. Overtime is underpaid, and there are no paid days off and no holidays, among other conditions. If migrants claim their rights, the employer will retaliate. The VK garment factory case was similar in many ways. What is unusual in this case is the social audit. An annual social audit was done 4 years running since 2017 as a requirement by Tesco, the buyer, to fulfill its voluntary human rights due diligence commitments. The audit was conducted by Intertek to adhere to the SMETA standards, which is SEDEX members' ethical trade audit, and was contracted by VK Garment at the instruction of Tesco's local branch. No rights violations were identified in the reports and were overall positive. These reports are made available publicly as part of Tesco's PR. However, in 2020, Intertek also produced a separate confidential report solely and directly for Tesco. In the Tesco report, Intertek flagged concerns of labor rights violations and falsification of records, which Tesco supposedly investigated separately and which resulted in Tesco cutting ties with the VK factory. Eventually, it was revealed that workers had faced these exploitative conditions at least since the audit started in 2017, but factory managers had instructed workers not to reveal anything to auditors about VK Garment's sub-minimum wages or other labor rights violations. The lengths they took to deceive were extensive. An elaborate set of fake company payroll documents and pay slips were produced that workers had been forced to sign. Managers also forced workers to adhere to the lies by threatening job loss should the factory receive a bad audit, since, as they argued, this would trigger buyers like Tesco to cancel orders. This time, however, the workers had recently received training on their labor rights from a local NGO, Human Rights Development Foundation in this case, and were planning to submit demands to the factory management through collective bargaining at the time the audit was done. This is in July 2020. Under the Thai labor law, it is illegal for migrants to form their own unions, and there are no unions in Mesot area. So migrants are unprotected when they stand up for their rights. However, this newfound knowledge of their rights gave them the courage to speak up to the auditors, and around 27 workers gave accurate information on the situation. In violation of promises and standards of confidentiality, the auditors informed the management that workers reported violations and identified workers who spoke up. The workers were reportedly verbally threatened by management and then pressured to sign a blank sheet of paper and the back of their own photographs without specifying the reason why. VK Garment then demanded that all workers reapply for their existing current jobs by completing a new employment application in Thai, ceding their accrued seniority benefits. 134 of the factory's 211 workers did not sign applications to reapply for their existing jobs and were effectively fired by refusing entry. They were refused entry. In turn, the workers filed a complaint with local police and the Department of Labor Protection. In total, 136 workers filed a complaint with Labor Protection, claiming compensation for sub-minimum wages, including unpaid wages for working on holidays and weekly rest days, as well as insufficient overtime pay. The claims covered 2 years retroactively in accordance with the law's limitations. In addition, they claimed severance pay and pay in lieu of advanced notice. The total amount demanded came to 34.3 million Thai baht, or just over 1 million US dollars. Intertek provided all the SMETA reports and the private supplementary report in English to the labor inspector and later the Thai labor courts. Intertek also wrote summaries of the reports in Thai. The Thai summary gave VK a clean bill and gave no indication that VK management had manipulated workers and falsified records. Discrepancies between payroll and pay slips, which should have raised flags, were downplayed by Intertek, as were the claims of wage theft, by asserting that the detailed set of books and pay slips by VK, which were false and manufactured, were more believable than workers' truthful claims of pay stubs that were the equivalent of a piece of A4 paper ripped horizontally with just the name and wage showing. Furthermore, Intertek identified inconsistency among workers' reporting, but attributed it to the workers' unreliability. The contradiction among some workers who followed management's instructions and those who told the truth was also identified by Intertek as an indication of deceit. Intertek even broke rules of confidentiality and identified one worker who was in a lead in the case for compensation of back wages, citing that he had made no previous mention of wage discrepancies in order to discredit him. Generally, in the summary, Intertek omitted the lack of transparency and the likelihood of deception by VK management, which was noted in the private report to Tesco. Because Intertek was considered as an independent professional, the Labor Protection Inspector concluded its assessment based primarily on Intertek's summaries of its audits in Thai and the rationalization of the incongruity of the workers' claims, even though it is the opposite rationale that should be used in the case of coercion regarding inconsistencies in workers' testimony. Thus, the workers' claims of unpaid wages, failure to pay overtime, and work on holidays and rest days were dismissed. The labor inspector did, however, rule in favor of the workers in respect to severance pay and payment in lieu of advance notice and ordered compensation for a total of about 5.2 million Thai baht. Both VK Garment and the workers appealed the labor protections decision to the Thai labor courts. On appeal, the labor court, also citing Intertek's audit summaries, affirmed the labor inspector's rejection of the workers' wage theft claims, but ordered VK Garment to pay workers additional severance, bringing total compensation to only around 6.8 million Thai baht. Since then, the case has been caught up in a series of appeals that has delayed justice and payment of any of the money to the workers, and the appeal system is still ongoing to this day. Over.
Thank you for that context and insight, Bram. I think it really shows, right? The scales are already tipped towards the corporations. And when you have these auditing firms that are independent firms helping to tip the scales even further towards the corporations, how hard it is for workers to get fair compensation and to eliminate the abuses that they're facing in factories. And with that, we want to talk to Nye. We want to move and bring our next panelist into the conversation. Nye, your organization, the Independent Trade Union Federation, organizes with workers in Cambodia's garment industry. Can you talk about your experience with social auditing firms, such as the role that Impact Ltd played in the Hulu garment case and the importance of organized workers?
Thanks
អឺ
very
ខ្ញុំ
much,
ចង់បញ្ជាក់ឡើងវិញ
everyone.
ថាករណី
Allow me
ការ
to
កេងប្រវ័ញ្ចហ្នឹង
mention
គឺ
once
មាន
again the
មួយរោង
case
ចក្រ
of
នៅ
exploitation
Thailand Cambodia ហ្នឹង
happened in
គឺក្នុង
Hulu
អំឡុងពេល
Garment,
ឆ្នាំ
Cambodia.
2020
It was
អញ្ចឹង
during
គឺ ក្រុម
2020.
ហ៊ុនហ្នឹងបាន
That company
ដេរឲ្យខោអាវមាន
produced
3 brand គឺមា
for
ន
three
ទី
brands,
1 គឺ
including
អឺ Amazon ទី 2 Adidas
Amazon.
ហើយ
Number
ទី
two is
3 គឺ
Adidas,
ក្រុ
and
មហ៊ុន
thirdly,
Walmart
uh, it was for
ហើ
Walmart.
យកន្លងមក
And
តាមរ
so
យៈ
far,
Interfee សហការ
through
ជាមួយ
into
WRC និង
fee,
Clinical
my
Campaign បានយកនាឡិកាទៅ
Union
ថ្មីក្បត់
Federation
ដល់
and
ក្រុមហ៊ុនហ្នឹងការស
WRC,
ង
we
ដែរ
had campaign
ហើយនៅ
to
ឆ្នាំ
demand for
2021
compensation. In
ក្រុមសាមត
2021, the
របស់
group
ក្រុម
of
ហ៊ុន Amazon
auditor
បានចុះមកប្រកួត
from
កម្មសិទ្ធិ
Amazon
ប៉ុន្
company
តែវាអ
visited
ត់បាន
Cambodia,
ដឹងថារបាយ
but
ការណ៍ទៀតប្រទេសថៃ
we
យ៉ាងម៉េចទេ
did not
នៅ
know
ពេល
what
ដែល
the
តំ
report
ណាងរបស់ក្រុមហ៊ុន
say,
Amazon ហ្នឹង
what
បាន
their
ជួប
report
ជាមួយ
say.
កម្មវិធីកម្មករ
So when a
ក៏ពេលហ្នឹង
representative
ក៏
of
ភាគី
Amazon came to
គាត់ក៏
Cambodia
បាន
to
ចូល
talk
ចូល
to
ជួបជាមួយ
workers,
ខាងយុ
they
តិធធ
met
ដែរ
with employer
ប៉ុន្តែ
as
ឧ
well.
ទាហរណ៍យ៉ាងណាយើង
But
មិនឮការឆ្លើយ
we
តប
did not
ដោយ
know
អ្នកណាទេ
what
ហើយ
the
នៅឆ្នាំ
result or response from that
2023
interview
មាន
or
តំណាង
their
កម្មករឈ្មោះ
visit.
ពិសាល
And
មក
then
ពី
in
កម្មករមួយចំនួនហ្នឹងគាត់បានទៅផ្ទេរការ
2003,
ជំរុញឲ្យ Adidas ហ្នឹង
a worker
សងប្រាក់ឈ្នួ
from
ល
Hulu
មកសង
Garment,
វិញវាចិត្ត
her
នៅ
name
Hulu ហ្នឹង
is
ប្រមាណជា 500 នាក់
Pisal. Yeah,
ហើ
she
យនៅឆ្នាំ
joined a campaign to
2024
demand
ខ្ញុំ
for
ប្អូនហ្នឹងបាន
compensation
ទៅដល់អាល្លឺម៉ង់
for
បានជួប
500
ជាមួយ អ្នក ផ្គត់ផ្
workers
គុំនិងកិច្ចប្រជុំនៅ
in
ប្រទេ
Hulu
សអាល្លឺម៉ង់
Garment. And I
នៅពេលហ្នឹងខ្ញុំ
then
បានជជែកគ្នា
in
ជាមួយ
20
អ្នក
late
អភិ
some
បាល
years
នៃ
later,
តំបន់
I
ហ្នឹង
went to
គាត់ថា
Germany
គាត់
to
ឯ
talk
ក
to
ភាពក្នុងការ
stakeholders
ទទួល
in
សងប៉ុន្តែនៅពេលហ្នឹង
in
គាត់ចង់
Germany
ឲ្យ
in order to demand for
ខាង
compensation for
Amazon ផ្ដល់
workers.
ជាម្
And
ចាស់ដេរ
stakeholders
នៅ
or
Hulu ហ្នឹងជាជាសា
shareholder
ធារណៈហើយគាត់
in
មិនសូវបានសង
Amazon,
ប៉ុ
they
ន្តែយើងក៏
said
បាន
that
លើក
they
ចិត្តគាត់
would
ថាឯ
pay,
ងសង
but
ចឹងមិន
then
ឲ្យសងទៅអានទៀតហើយដើម្បីតែជាគាត់ត្រូវបាន
I don't know
គាត់ថាគាត់
how
អត់ទាន់សង
much,
ទេ
yeah,
ហើយយើងជជែកនឹង Amazon ទៅ
what
ដែលគាត់អ្នក
percentage
ផ្ទេរអញ្
they
ចឹងអ្វី
should
ដែលយើង
pay.
បានយុទ្ធនា
So
ការនៅ
we
ក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជា
yeah,
ក៏ដូចជាមួយនឹង
basically,
អាមេ
finally
រិក
they did
ទៅ
not
ដល់អា
pay
ល្លឺ
yet.
ម៉ង់ក្នុង
And
ការ
then we
ជំរុញឲ្យការ
campaign
ជួបជុំហ្នឹងវាហាក់ដូចជា
as a result
មិន
from
មាន
our
អ្វី
campaign
ដែលជាលទ្ធ
to
ផ
the
លក្នុងកា
US,
រ
to
ឲ្យយើងមើលឃើញថា
Germany. We
ក្រុម
still
ហ៊ុន
don't see any
Amazon ក៏ដូច
result
ជាក្រុម
which Amazon
Adidas
as well as
ព្រម
Adidas
ទទួលសម្ដែង
have
ទៅដល់យល់ហេតុផល
provided
ថា
any
អ្វីដែល
compensation
ឯ
yet.
កសារដឹកនាំឲ្យ
Their
ក្រុមហ៊ុន
claim
Hulu ហ្នឹង
is
រៀបចំ
that
ហ្នឹង
the
ទោះបី
document
គាត់មាន
provided
ថា
by Hulu government, although
ឯ
they
កសារមួយ
know
ចំនួន
that
ត្រូវបានគេ
some
បន្លំឬក៏
documents
ថ្លែងបន្ល
were
ំនៅ
fake
លើលិខិត
or
បញ្ឈប់ជាទូទៅ
falsifies.
យើងដឹងហើយលិ
For
ខិតបញ្ឈ
example,
ប់គឺដាក់
like
ហើយបាន
resignation
ក្រុមហ៊ុនគាត់
letter,
វាប្រាក់ឈ្នួល
because
តាមក្រមវិចិត្រប៉ុន្តែ
for
ដោយឡែក
resignation letter, it's
នៅ
only
តាមលិ
after
ខិត default ទៅ
application
តាមក្រម
that
វិចិត្រនៅ Hulu
the
ហ្នឹងគឺ
company
លិខិត
would
default ហ្នឹងគេពាក់មួយ
calculate
ហើយសងមួយ
the
អញ្ចឹងវា
calculate
ក្នុង
the
អំឡុងពេល
amount
ទៀតគាត់
of
បញ្ចុះខ
severance
ុស
pay.
ខ្មែរ
But
ដែរក្នុងអំឡុងពេល
yeah,
ពេល
in
មួយហ្នឹង
case of
អញ្ចឹងធ្វើឲ្យកម្មករ
Hulu
មួយចំ
garment
នួនគឺសម្ភា
workers,
រៈប្របាក់
the
លឿនណាស់ហើយគាត់
yeah, the
ពិបាកនឹងត្រឡប់ទៅ
company
ទៅស្រុ
already
កកំណើតអញ្ចឹង
calculate
កម្មករមួយចំនួនគាត់
their
ក៏មិនខំ
payment
ចិត្ត
before
ក្នុងការទទួលយកលុយ
they
មួយចំនួនហ្នឹងហើយ
submit
ក៏បាន
the
ប្រែប្រួលដល់
resignation letter, and it was during
ក្រសួ
my
ងការ
union
ងារ
time.
ក្រសួងការងារ
It
គាត់
was
បាន
a
លើក
bit
ហេតុផលដូច
difficult
បាននិយា
for
យចឹងគឺ
workers,
ការ
so
ស
they
ង្កេ
had
តលើ
no
លិខិ
other
តខំបន្លំ
choice
ហ្នឹងថាបា
but
ក់នេះគឺជា
just
យ៉ាងណាអញ្ចឹង
to
គេសំអាង
yeah
លើលិខិត
just
ហ្នឹង
to
គេមិនបានចាត់ឲ្យ
agree
ទៅ
to
ទៅស្រុក
sign
សង
for
ខាង
some
ប្រទេស
workers, and
ករណី
then
នេះគឺយើងបានបញ្ជូនទៅ
the
ដល់បេក្ខ
case
ញ្ញា
was
បណ្ដាលហើយហើយហាក់ដូច
referred
ជា
to the
នៅតែ
Ministry
ក្នុង
of
ស្តង់ដារដ
Labor,
ដែលយើង
and
ដឹង
the
ថាលិខិត
Ministry of
default ការងារហ្នឹង
Labor
ជាផ្លូវការហើយយើងក៏បានជជែ
yeah
កគ្នាជាមួយ
just
ក្រុមប្រឹក្សាអាជ្ញាកណ្
consider
ដាលនៃ
that
គណៈ
it
កិ
was
ច្ចការវិទ្យាដែរ
legitimate
ថាបើសិនជា
resignation letter, and
មាន
then
ការ
they
ឯកភាពនៃការ
they
យកឈុតប្រឆាំងហ្នឹង
took
មែន
the
ក្រុម
side
ហ៊ុនជា
of
ប់ច្បាប់ហ្នឹង
the
ទូនាទី
employer.
ធ្វើការត្រូវ
The
បានលើ
case
ខាង
went
ក្រុម
to
ហ៊ុន
the
Hulu
arbitration
Garment ទេ
council,
ហើយក៏អត់មាន
and
សិទ្ធិ
the
បដូរ
arbitration
ច្បាប់មួយ
council
ចំនួន
uphold
ក៏
the
មានការបណ្ដឹង
decision
ដឹង
from
ដល់
the
ថាក្រសួង
ministry,
ការងារ
and
ក៏បា
then
នជួយសាងអាជ្ញាកណ្
the
ដាលដែរ
workers did not
មកដល់បច្ចុប្បន្នហ្នឹង
still did not agree to that,
យើងមើ
and
លឃើ
up
ញ
to
ថា
now we
ដូច
can
ជា
see that
ខាង
the
Amazon ហ្នឹងបានឆ្លើយមកទៀតទៅគឺ
for Amazon they
ខាង
stopped
Adidas ឆ្លើយ
responding,
ថាគាត់នឹងធ្វើការ
and for
ឲ្យតែ
Adidas, the
ក្រុម
latest
ហ៊ុន Amazon
response,
ព្រมសង
they
កម្មករ
said that
Hulu ហ្នឹងគាត់នឹង
as
ចូលរួម
long
ការ
as
សងព្រោះគាត់ថាគាត់
Amazon
ដេរមិន
company agreed
តិច
to
តួចដែរហើយគាត់នឹងចូលរួមការ
compensate
សងដែរប៉ុន្តែ
the
នៅការស
workers,
ងមុនគាត់
they would
បដិ
join
សេធមិនព្រ
with
ម
the
ទទួលស
compensation.
ងមុ
So
នទេ
they said that
យើងបា
as
នលើក
long
ហេតុ
as
បញ្ជាក់គាត់ថាអ្នកឯងគឺជាគំរូ
as long as Amazon pay, they will do it, but they will not be the first to pay. And we encourage them to start first, but they said that we should go to talk to Amazon first before they take that action to pay workers. And that's all from me. Thanks very much. If you have questions, you can ask me later. Thank you.
Thank you, Naya. I think that thing that Nye is bringing here, right, is like workers are organizing here against global corporations, right? Like the brands that you heard in Amazon and Adidas, these are global international corporations with billions of dollars backing them, creating obviously an unbalanced situation here for workers. And with that, I want to bring in our next panelist, Tulsi Narayanswamy, who is coming to us from the Worker Rights Consortium, which is an independent labor rights organization that monitors working conditions in factories around the world and conducted investigations in each of these cases from the report. Tulsi, can you talk some about how the Worker Rights Consortium's investigations differ from traditional social audits?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And I just want to say hi to everyone. It's really lovely to see so many people joining for this really important topic. And thanks for having me. So, Cassie, to answer your question in terms of the nature of our approach to investigations and why we are able to pick up on violations that tend to be missed, I think it's important to maybe consider what the function of our organization is, because I think that in large part is why we're able to pick up and remediate violations. So very quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with the Worker Rights Consortium or the WRC, we're an independent monitor of the production of apparel and footwear in factories around the world. We leverage our long history in this role and our expert global team that are based in garment producing countries to investigate labor conditions. And when we conduct investigations, we document these violations using a robust framework of legal obligations and norms based in those countries. And on the basis of that, we remediate violations from freedom of association and union busting through to wage theft. And so the emphasis for us as an organization is not just uncovering the nature of labor violations, but actually remediating them. So fixing the issue. And I think that's really important, because I think that really is very different to why the social auditing business exists and what the intentions of them are. I won't talk about that for the purpose of answering your question briefly, but I think it is important to bear that in mind when considering how we differ from social auditing companies. So in all of the cases, I should say, where the WRC identifies violations of worker rights, multiple brands will have conducted dozens of audits in those very same factories where we identify serious violations. So they would have had a tick box approach conducted by a range of companies, including some of them in this report, and they would have failed to either pick up on them or remediate them to respond to what they did pick up on. So I think in terms of the ways that I could explain the guiding principles of the WRC in terms of what we use across our investigations that differ, this is how I broke it down for the purposes of this. The first is looking really critically at the employer story. The second is monitoring and understanding the local context and how it changes. And the third is our approach to independent offsite worker interviews. So for the first one, I feel like the speakers that went before me have done a really great job of listing various ways in which management have come forward with an explanation for either why workers were willing to voluntarily cede their rights or why they apparently did something that was going to undermine their own rights. You know, there are lots of ways of us being able to frame this, but you know, a big part of what our job is as investigators is looking critically at that employer story of what is actually taking place in the factory. And to do that really requires going beyond the narrative that will be provided by the factory, because there is always a narrative to justify what's happening that is provided by the factory. And our job is to proactively scrutinize the evidence behind what they claim. And a big part of our ability to be able to do that is the fact that this is what we do as an organization, and we have a great deal of experience in navigating deception by factory owners and management. You know, I think in the case of Hulu, that was already kind of explained how this played out. Same in the case of VK, and that's also the case with Hong Seng, that the management said one thing, the workers say one thing, and then it ends up being a situation of he said, she said. But actually, when it comes to our role, what we do find is that there is always evidence to support this, and it should be the job of an investigator to find what that evidence is, and that's certainly what our approach is to investigations. I won't go into case studies just for the sake of time, but we can cover them perhaps in Q&A. But I would say that when it comes to things like faked books or double bookkeeping, it really is something that is such a standard practice that we ought to expect it, that simply is happening in factories. Bogus pay sheets where managers have faked thumbprints. I think this is maybe my favorite one, where managers have faked thumbprints to supposedly sign for hundreds of workers, and we find that actually it's just a few different people repeating thumbprints. We see forged correspondence, fraudulent statements from officials suggesting it's fine to ignore labor law. There are lots and lots of ways in which this happens, and I think it's frankly alarming the extent to which this is missed by social auditing companies, because I think, as Anna was saying at the beginning, this gross power imbalance, which plays out for supply chain workers in factories between employer and employee, is so vast that having any kind of mechanism that is pushing more power towards the employer and what the employer story is of what's happening is incredibly dangerous. That takes me to the second way I think that makes our investigation stand apart from social auditing companies, which is our approach to monitoring local developments and what the local context is. Because deception by factory owners isn't limited to falsifying documents or coaching workers to tell auditors that everything is great. We frequently come across factory owners making false claims about the application of labor laws, or leaning on corrupt officials or institutions to make false claims. And I think that's really important to note, because the countries with the lowest wages that make them attractive to corporations to source from there in the first place are also unsurprisingly often countries with like authoritarian governments or a severely constrained civic space and politically compromised institutions. And it's something that really contributes to making this phenomenon really common. And so when a brand or an auditor comes in and justifies a factory, for example, leaning on something that's happened as a result of corruption or utilizing an institution that is no longer independent, that can incredibly impact workers and their ability to be able to fight for their rights more broadly. And I think, again, I'm not going to go into any detail with case studies for the sake of time, but a lot of this really does feel quite like it seems like a common sense approach, right? Like applying a cookie cutter approach which many social auditing companies do to understanding workers around the globe is of course going to miss it. If you're only looking, for example, for discrimination based on gender, but you're looking at a context where discrimination frequently happens along the lines of caste or a language group, you're obviously going to miss that, right? So I think a lot of this is common sense, but unfortunately, given the tick box approach that's used by social auditing companies, it does mean that things get lost. So for us, keeping really close track of developments in the regulatory and the political environment and applying that is really helpful. I think, for example, in the case of Hong Seng, knowing that workers were supposed to be paid during periods of furlough and that was being applied by other factories, that was something that, for example, helped us to be able to respond in that case. And the very last point that I'll make is just our approach to worker interviews. So not only is our approach to conduct worker interviews individually and off-site, they're arranged independent of the factory. And I think that last point is really important, particularly in light of the power imbalance and also the conflict of interest that Anna was alluding to at the beginning. Offsite interviews, of course, kind of absence the power dynamic that kind of exists within a factory, even if you're taking workers into another room or assuring them, as was the case of VK Garments, the workers who were so frightened for 3 years from 2017 to 2020 to speak honestly about what their conditions were. At the point in which they did decide to speak, they were reassured by the factory management that it was safe to speak, only to then immediately, the very same day, face retaliation for speaking out about those conditions. And I think that's really illustrative of how important it is to have an independent entity be able to conduct and understand what exactly is happening with workers so that they don't have to deal with that power imbalance. When we're arranging interviews, we are doing that either through a union or a labor organization or directly with workers rather than having to lean on management. And I think that's a really important element that most frequently is missing when it comes to the function of social auditing companies. I'll finish there, but I do think it's important to kind of grapple with why the social auditing industry exists and what purpose it serves, because I think understanding that difference between whether or not it's serving its purpose as glossing over a lot of the labor violations that exist as a matter of course is the intention of it, or if there really is the intention of properly picking up on violations and remediating them. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Tosi. It's a really important last point that you landed on there. And that brings us to our next panelist, Christy Madama from the Clean Clothes Campaign. Christy, your organization, the Clean Clothes Campaign, is a network of over 200 organizations operating in over 45 countries in support of workers in the garment and sportswear industries. I know Clean Clothes Campaign has been very involved in campaigning on several of the cases featured in the report. Can you talk a little bit about the roles that social auditing firms have played in your experience?
Yes, thank you so much for this great report and also for giving me the opportunity to speak a little bit about these cases. So as the Clean Clothes Campaign Network, we work on concrete violations of garment worker rights and campaign on the basis of that. And actually, we've been campaigning on all three of the cases featured in the report. I myself have been most involved in the Hulu case and the Hong Seng case, so I can speak most in more detail to that. I think so. If the question is indeed in what kind of ways are social auditing firms active in these cases, I think there's two ways in which you can encounter social audit in a factory case like this. In some cases, the audit has already been and has never identified the issues that then later are identified by somebody else, and the company involved brand that we will be reaching out to has in advance been reassured that nothing was wrong, and then actually something is uncovered in their supply chain. The other thing, which is what we see in the Hulu case and in the Hong Seng case, is that actually something is brought up and then the buyer turns to a social audit company saying, hey, we've heard this, what's your take? And it's very interesting, especially in these three cases, where we're talking about research, as Tulsi just explained, done by the Worker Rights Consortium, really thorough research that shows this is the full context of what is happening. It's not as we're bringing any hearsay to the brand saying, well, somebody from your supply chain alleges this, and that they say, well, then we need to do a little bit more research to figure out what happened. No, this has been extensively researched, all the context is there, and then still the buyer says, let us do this again. So they are turning to social audit companies to redo the research, essentially. Of course, paying for that. And it's pretty clear that their assignment to those social auditing companies is back up our arguments, please, or show us a different story. Because the story is out there, the research is out there, everything has been looked at. But nevertheless, at least in this second scenario, these buyers are turning to social auditing companies to ask them, look at this again and give us something. Of course, maybe not explicitly saying, I don't know what's happening in that conversation between the social audit company and the brand, but the interview is out there. The research is out there, and they're still asking to do the research again, presumably to get an answer that they like better. So as we're looking at these cases, if we're looking, for example, at the Hong Seng case, 3 different external checks were done after the WRC research. So Nike first reached out to Elevate, then they reach out to this law firm, then they reach out to the FLA. This means that for 5 years, this case has been dragging on. Money has been going to external people, to consultants, to audit companies, whereas all of that time could have been used to just use the research that was already there to remedy the workers that were wronged, for which all of the information was there, all of the proof was there in the research that was done by the WRC. So this is one of the ways in which we've seen social auditing reports dragging out cases. We see that it adds a layer of lack of transparency. It adds a layer of confusion because then buyers can tell a social auditing company to do this research, and then they usually come back to us whenever we write to them saying you need to provide remedy to the workers in this case, and they say, well, we've done this research, and actually the social auditing company says this and this and that, which is entirely different from yours. And we say, okay, well, please show us the research that the social auditing company did, and they will say, no, that's confidential. So this lack of transparency creates further confusion in the case beyond dragging on the case as well. And then lastly, I think an effect of these social auditing reports happening in ongoing cases is that it actually creates harmful interpretations of what happens in supply chains. We see, and I think the word power has already been mentioned quite a lot, the power imbalance in supply chains, in factories, is in all of the cases that that are featured in this report is not taken into account, not fully taken into account. The situation of a migrant worker who fears for their ability to stay in a country, who fears for their livelihood. If somebody tells you you need to sign this, the level of coercion needed to get somebody in such a precarious situation to do that is much lower than somebody who is in a much more stable situation, who has a wage that they can live on, who has a residency status somewhere that is stable. So what we see is that a lot of these social auditing companies that have stepped in on these cases talk about consent where there is no consent if you look more closely. And especially if you look at the power imbalance that is there, and especially if you consider the situation of these workers, we're also talking about things like literacy. Yes, you can put a piece of paper in front of someone and say, now you have the full information that you need to make this decision, whether you want to give away your wage or resign from your job. If that worker is hardly literate, that doesn't constitute consent. And what we see is that a lot of the analysis that's being made is absolutely power blind and is talking from a very dry perspective. And this is very, very hurtful, not only for the specific workers that are denied remedy or where remedy is delayed. It also sets a precedent of impunity elsewhere in the industry, where brands and specifically manufacturers see that these kind of methods are okay to use, that retaliation done in the right way might not be called retaliation, that forcing workers to resign or forcing workers to sign away their wages, if it's done in a specific way, is treated as consent. And that the fact that these kind of practices are being sanctioned by audits, are being justified by audits, is harmful far beyond these three specific cases.
Thank you for that, Christy. And I want to bring in, we're going to try to bring in the voice of a worker who worked at the factories in these cases that the report does some deep dives into. So we're going to turn to Pasal. Pasal, can you hear me?
បងគាត់នៅនេះឥឡូវគាត់ចូលតាម Zoom អត់បានតែក៏ខ្ញុំពងទំនាក់ទំនងមួយគាត់នៅក្នុង Facebook គាត់ពងស្ដាប់បានគាត់អាចនិយាយទៅបង
Pasal
ជួយ
is
cooperate ឲ្យគាត់
not able to join in the
មានរបបទៅគាត់សម្ដែងខ្លួនបន្តិច
Zoom, but she can join through Facebook and she will
អូខេ
speak
ពិសា
and
ចាប់ផ្ដើម
we can interpret. Hello, I'm Paul Pisal, a former worker in Hulu Garment. We were terminated during the time of COVID, and we so far don't receive appropriate remedy yet. And the company, they said what they said is that the terminated workers already receive their compensation, but in reality, we have not received uh, the uh, the due compensation according to the law because they terminated us while we had the contract and the contract was still valid. I also I went to the USA maybe in 2023, but the compensation still I mean we still don't receive the compensation so far. Yeah.
មានន័យថែមទៀតទេវិសាមានន័យថែមប្រាប់គាត់ឲ្យអត់ទៅ
Tonight ask if you have anything else to add. And at the time I went to the USA, there was a university asked us, they said that whether we received the compensation already, and we informed them accordingly that we have not received the due payment. We need sovereign pay and damage as well as the payment in lieu of prior notification because they have not notified us for that.
មានន័យទៀតទេឬក៏អស់ហើយ
And such payment we have not received yet.
ខ្ញុំចង់បញ្ជាក់បន្ថែមតិចទៀតណាងូវិសាលមានន័យថា
And so tonight at that
តាំងពីយើងធ្វើការទាមទារឲ្យមានការសងពីក្រម
so
Amazon
since
ពី
the
ក្រម
time
Adidas ហ្នឹងក៏
we
ដោយ
demand
បច្ចុប្បន្ន
for
ហ្នឹងគឺខាង
compensation
ការប្រយុទ្ធ
from
ជាតិ
Amazon
ប្រមាណ
and
ជា 500
Adidas,
ហ្នឹងអត់ទាន់
although
ធ្វើ
we
សម្ដៅ
made
ទេច
the
ង់បញ្ជាក់
demand,
ប៉ុណ្ណឹង
but
ណា
up to
ហើយក
now,
ន្លងមក
the
គឺ
500
ក្រុម
workers
ហ៊ុន
have not received
ក៏
the
ដូចជា
due
តំណាង Adidas
payment.
ឬ Amazon ហ្នឹង
And
គេ
so far,
តាមរយៈក្រុមហ៊ុន
representative
បាន
of
ប្រកាសជាមាន
Adidas
ទូរទស្សន៍
and
សំឡេងស៊ូមកម្មកររួចហើយ
Amazon
តែ
and
គ្រប់ទៅ
Adidas,
ដល់បច្ចុប្បន្នហ្នឹង
they said
គឺគ
that
កម្មករអត់
the
ទាន់បាន
company
ទទួលទាន
claimed
សូ
that
មបញ្ជា
they
ក់ប៉ុណ្ណឹង
already
ទៅមាន
paid
អ
the
រគុណច្រើន
workers, but in reality, workers don't receive it yet. And this is Apisal. So we would not have a kind of drag the case on for so many years if we were actually receive the real compensation. So why should we spend time to demand if they really already paid it? So why should we keep the kind people who try to help us busy if but what we are doing, we try to get the right thing what we are entitled to receive. And however, up to now, we have not received the compensation that compensation from the company in the amount that they should give to us. Thank you.
អូខេបងសកលគាត់អស់ហើយមានប៉ុណ្ណឹងហ្នឹងហើយ
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pasal, for joining us. I think what we hear there from Pasal is the great lengths that workers have to go to, right? When these reports undermine their valid concerns and their valid complaints of what's happening in their workforce, right? We're talking about workers traveling to Germany and traveling to the US just to bring their reports directly to the corporations when these firms' reports are undermining what's really happening to them in the workplace. And with that, I want to return to Anna. Anna, in your opinion, why are these social audits failing to uncover abuses? Sorry,
Um,
Anna, you're mute. It wouldn't be a webinar if that didn't happen
Would
at
not
least
be a
once.
webinar. I am here to represent for webinar forever. Um, I mean, first off, I just want to really appreciate Pascal and the whole team of people in WhatsApp chats that you cannot see on here that made that possible. Um, it just gives me chills. The extent to which workers and coordinated campaigns have to go to get remedy for workers for money that they are legally owed. Like, we're not even talking about anything really grand and excessive here. We are talking about like a real baseline of pay people what they're owed for their work. So huge appreciation for everybody who made that happen. And all these social audit firms who are making money on this should be embarrassed right now. But that brings me to, I will make my answer to this short. I think really three words: money and power. What we see here time and again is that the incentives are stacked towards preserving the status quo and protecting companies' reputations as opposed to uncovering abuses. What Pascal was just pointing to, right, is that time is on the company's side, that workers need to get paid. Companies, they can just sit and wait this out too often, which is the role of these international campaigns, is keeping these voices in the foreground. I hope that when people hear the words Amazon, Adidas, Nike, they think about these long overdue wage theft cases, right? In each of these cases, why are they failing to uncover? I think that we see that in these cases, the auditors aren't actually failing necessarily to uncover abuses. Sometimes they're just obscuring them, right? The Fair Labor Association, the FLA's report on Hong Seng, and Intertech's multiple reports in the VK Garment case are both particularly stark examples of how, even when auditors are hearing stories of abuses, threats of retaliation, and misconduct, they're writing them up in audit reports that then let the company off the hook. Um, so yeah, I think that's the failures there.
I want to just thank our audience today for joining us and let you know that we will be going to your questions in just a few minutes. And we just have one final question for our panelists here, and then we'll transition to audience questions. Christy, uh, your organization published a report called Fig Leaf for Fashion in 2019 that examined the role of social auditing industry at that time. What changes, if any, have you seen since then?
Yeah, I think reading this new report, remembering the writing of the other one, of course, there are small things that we can point at, but I think the main feeling that comes across reading both of those reports is how little changed. Um, Social auditing companies are still mainly serving the interests of those who pay them. They still refuse to publish their findings, and they still do not have the means to actually expose and address human rights abuses. I'm also thinking, like in the meantime, between these two reports, WRC has also, Human Rights Watch has done research uncovering, for example, how much copy pasting is happening in these kind of audit reports when it comes to, for example, freedom of association. That just the same answers appear again and again and again. This is very problematic and is not changing. Yet companies continue to rely on them. Buyers continue to rely on them, and this might even increase in the wake of due diligence legislation, which then they think they can abide to by doing more of these social audits. Um, so you are almost asking yourself, how often do we have to expose them? Because if I'm going back even further, sadly, in 2005, we also published a report that was called Looking for a Quick Fix. uh, that also exposed these problems. This is not something new, and this system is broken, and it's been broken for a very, very long time, and it's been known for a very long time. But as long as it continues to serve corporate interests, it will keep on existing. And very large amounts of money will keep on flowing towards these companies and these organizations that do these audits. Um, and I think I'm actually repeating a little bit what Anne already said, just I'll keep it short. But indeed, factory inspections can really only be meaningful if workers and their organizations are central to how they are conducted, and how they are monitored. They can only be meaningful if transparency is an essential part of it, if the outcomes of inspections are known, most importantly to the actual people who are working in the factory, and not being kept as some private knowledge and some private property of the people who are paying for it, can only be meaningful if inspections are actually independent of the financial incentives of buyers and manufacturers and are done by qualified people who actually know what they're talking about, what they're researching, and how to do it in the like off-site interviews, as Tulsi so very clearly explained. And indeed, eventually only if buyers are held accountable are by binding agreements will they work towards a meaningful remedy. And these are very basic things, and I think we've been saying them for a long time, unfortunately. But this has to change, and these are the essential elements to make change possible.
Thank you. And with that, we're gonna move to audience questions. And we're gonna go to our first question, which I think brings much of what we've heard today in the deep dive in the report about how flawed these audits are. And they cause real harm, right? Like just checking boxes, the lack of transparency. These are causing workers who are on the call today, who for years are still organizing for stolen wages. And so the first question is for Anna. The report said firms have flawed audit methodology. What do you suggest for transparency and accountability, and who should be responsible to take the lead and make firms accountable?
Yeah, and I think we see a couple of questions coming in on the backside around this question of like, well, what could be better? And I think one of the key things I would want to emphasize, having like been involved in this certification watchdog world for a really long time, is this system is fundamentally and structurally flawed. And so I think like little tweaks, like we keep on getting into these conversations around little tweaks around the edges. And I'll just keep coming back to the key point, which is we need to change the actual system, who has money, who has power to incentivize rights respecting outcomes. Um, so, the report has some recommendations for what could be more rights respecting, but I think Christy did a really great job just now of laying out the fact that we have been in a decades long conversation about the failures of this model. And again, I think I come back to, I don't think the system is broken. I think the system is really showing us it is working as designed to provide cover for companies and give them the ability to point to something that says, actually, the status quo is pretty all right. And the problem is, maybe you have a rogue supplier or whatever, but overall, it does not come back to changing brand purchasing practices, which I think is really the fundamental issue here, that we need to change brand purchasing practices so that they are rights respecting, so that they actually pay living wages, and the cost of doing business in a rights respecting way. I'm just going to keep saying the word rights respecting over and over here. I think one of the key pieces that Christy again was pointing to is the importance of worker-driven, legally binding, enforceable protections as the gold standard for human rights protections in supply chains. Um, so, we can go through some of the tweaks that could be done, fundamentally. I think we really need to move away from this checkbox model of superficial audits to be replaced by independent, rigorous inspection and verification. So inspectors that operate independently of the financial control and influence of buyers. Um, Social audit firms as for-profit entities, like we've seen how the race to the bottom works in global capitalism in general. We have applied that to rights verification. It's not going well. I think we can all see that. Um, and so, there's more recommendations in the work or in the report, but I really think that we need to be talking at this point about fundamentals. We've seen decades long of, how you can tweak around the edges, and it's not worked.
Thank you. And I think that brings us back to Tulsi's question earlier about like we really need to wrestle with are they actually serving the purpose that they were created to serve? And that brings us to our next question, which is for you, Tulsi, which is in the aftermath of recent publicity, night shift audits are being conducted to detect child labor, but these audits are announced. Can you speak to why unannounced versus announced audits are more beneficial and any case studies on the difference in those audit results?
Yes, I'm going to answer that question, and then I'm just going to gratuitously say some other stuff to agree with what the other speakers have said. But yeah, I mean, I think on that point, announced versus unannounced, it's kind of comparing something that's still very similar because you're still relying on management and their permission to be able to essentially enter a factory. And what that means for workers who are carefully observing what's happening around them is they can see who it is that is kind of who they're working with in order to kind of conduct these. Of course, I think there is lots that we can talk about. Yes, of course. Is it better if it's unannounced? Sure, it's better. Is that what's going to make the huge difference between picking up on the nature of violations and not picking up on the nature of violations? Perhaps not. I think it is very hard to talk about this with a broad brush, but I think the fundamental issue is the lack of independence of the auditors. And I think that fundamental conflict of interest that comes as a result of who's paying the auditor and the fact that that's very frequently the factory themselves or the brand means that that lack of independence is essentially an immovable facet of the nature of corporate social auditing, and that will inevitably impact the ways in which the findings are presented and what ends up happening as a result of those findings. That's not to say that it's impossible for anything to be picked up, but I think what we're talking about here, separate to the three cases that are covered in this report, is that if you take a step back and consider what is the wholesale impact of having corporate social auditing companies go in and essentially rubber stamp or just find a few particular violations, is that we're essentially further removed from our ability to be able to really understand how it is that these violations come to be and the systematic nature of these violations. And I think what Anna was saying about the fact that it's brands themselves that are generating and creating the conditions of systemic labor violations, if the violations are systemic, the fact that we're not receiving information from auditing companies about the systemic nature of this and rather just seeing, something caught here or something caught there, I think the ultimate kind of impact of that is to whitewash how systematically these violations occur. And I think, to me, the one thing that will never cease to amaze me, although I think maybe that just indicates I'm a slow learner, is that when we have a situation where minimum wages in garment producing countries are so far below a living wage, where workers simply are not earning enough to be able to survive, that in order to be able to maintain that, it requires a level of suppressing the right to organize, that like the enabling right that allows workers to be able to fight for all of their other rights, of course, is the right to organize. And the incredibly ruthless nature in which this is cracked down upon in so many different factories around the world, I think is indicative of the fact that that is responded to by factories because they know that brands are not going to increase their prices. They know that workers are going to ultimately be kept in a situation of exploitation permanently as a part of this kind of global supply chain system that we're talking about. So I think that's really important to understand, is that it's tweaking around the edges really is simply not enough to address the broader impact of auditors and essentially justifying a system of wholesale exploitation of workers.
Thank you. With that, we're going to direct our next question to Christy, kind of building off the last two questions. What is the alternative to the profit-driven approach of social auditing firms? If it's not the brands and companies, who will fund workplace investigations in a more fair way on the scale that we need it? Could this be public sector, or could public sector and academic research handle the volume of workplaces that need investigating?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. A good question as well that I think we need to explore further. I think we see very good examples of where workplace inspections can actually be independent and can be thorough. Of course, Tulsi explained how the WRC works, and I think that's a great example. Another good example is the International Court, which conducts inspections of so safety inspections primarily of factories in their under their coverage. And this is the money for the accord comes through the companies that that join this legally binding program. But the program itself is independent and is co-run by unions. And I think that is something that we keep on mentioning again and again, that these binding agreements that are worker-driven is really the only way that change is possible. And that then still indeed finances, there is enough money. If we see the social auditing industry is showing that there is enough money available in this whole industry that is flowing around to address issues in global supply chains. It's just flowing to the wrong people with the wrong incentives and without any transparency and any worker influence. So it's these binding agreements that give workers, well, not only a seat at the table, that make them central to what's happening, that make unions, put unions at the center of designing and monitoring these programs. That then indeed, of course, this fixing this industry needs to be paid by the people who have made money of it for a very long time and who continue to make money of it. But the fact that they are paying shouldn't mean that they decide how, like that they decide the direction of what is happening. And that is why these binding agreements are so important. And the Accord is one example of that. There are other proposals on the table, including on wage theft and severance theft, which, of course, we're talking about today. The pay workers agreement, the proposal is on the table. It has been proposed to many brands, and nobody currently has stepped up to sign this agreement. And yeah, it's there is an answer out there. But currently, as I said before, this system serves the interests of the brands well enough. Failing workers by design was the tagline to our 2019 report. So yeah, this system is broken, but indeed it was designed to be broken on behalf of the workers. And there's not enough incentive yet. Apparently, apart from the Accord, which of course had the major incentive of the Rana Plaza collapse back in 2013. But on other issues, brands have not had enough incentive yet to step away from the system. And I think we're all here to create that incentive for brands and make sure that they feel that push. So we just need to keep going.
Thank you. This next question we're going to direct to Anna. Anna, even in the case of legitimate audit reports, have you found that the audit scheme doesn't impose sanctions on suppliers who continue to evade resolution of the findings?
Yeah, first, just in response to what Christy has just said, I think, right, like this is the absolute absurdity of this system that we're in, right? Like Christy just referred to the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013 as the incentive for brands to join that system. That is 1,100 people dead, plus thousands more permanently, in many cases, injured. And that we are waiting, or that brands collectively are waiting on that level of catastrophe to take action is absolutely appalling. And that there is an entire system rigged to help companies continue to point to any number of sustainability things to take that pressure off, I think is absolutely appalling. And I continue to be outraged by that all the time. Um, so I think the question was like, are there audit schemes that don't impose sanctions on suppliers who continue to evade the resolution of findings? I think was the question. So first off, I mean, the audit firms are usually performing audits to some set of standards. The audit firm itself will often write a corrective action plan of some sort that says, standard said this, you should do that. Um, the ways that different standards establish those corrective action plans really vary. Bram earlier was talking, for example, about Intertek performing the SMETA or the audits to the SMETA standard. To be a member of SEDEX, you don't have to fulfill all of those action plans. It's voluntary. You can just be like, oh, that that happened. And that silence is just, it goes into the void. So Um, I think that again comes back to the legally binding question that you need to have a standard that is worker driven, has union input, and then that there is a mechanism to hold suppliers and brands accountable to actually fulfilling corrective action plans.
Um, Thank you for that. I want to bring back Brahm and Nye into the conversation. This question, he'd like to hear from both of you. Can you both speak a little bit about the closing civil society space in Cambodia and Thailand and the impact that that has had on worker organizing? And we'll start with Brahm.
So this is a question about civil the civil space.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say that in Thailand we're not feeling as much imposition as some of our neighboring countries, but there's been an NGO bill that's kind of looming, and it would potentially have overreaching uh, powers to control the use of funding and things like that. But so currently, we're still operating as we would. But having said that, we only have so much power. We're a local NGO. The employers union is much stronger. Local officials still flout the law. We win cases on a regular basis, but then there's no enforcement. So the law, Thai law, still doesn't allow for unions, for migrants to organize their own unions, but it's been floated once, and then the bill was scuttled. So again, that's also kind of out there, but out of reach currently. So it's a difficult situation because we're allowed a certain amount of space to maneuver in, but then we kind of keep hitting the same glass ceiling in accessing remedy for workers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Nye, can you share a little bit about the impact that the closing of civil society spaces in Cambodia is having on workers?
សម្រាប់ខ្ញុំយល់
For
ឃើញ
me,
ថា
I
អឺ
think that
កត្តាចម្បងជាច្រើនទី
the
មួយគឺ
there
ការចូល
there
រួម
are
ចូលជាពី
many
ម្ចាស់
different
brand
factors.
សម្លៀក
One
បំពាក់ហ្នឹង
is the
ក៏ដូចជា
collusion uh,
និយាយ
with
ទៅម្
the
ចាស់ brand
I
ទាំងអស់
mean
ដែល
the
មាននិន្នាការដែល
the
មិន
collusion
បា
among
នលើកស្ទួយសិទ្ធិសេរី
brands.
ភាព
They
ខ្ញុំមើល
don't
ឃើញរួមទាំង brand
actively
របស់ជប៉ុនមួយ
promote
ដែលខ្ញុំ
the
បានធ្វើការចង
rights.
ក្រងការពី
There
មួយ
is
ឆ្នាំមុន
one
គាត់ធ្វើ
Japanese
ការបាន10
brand
ឆ្នាំ ប៉ុន្តែ
I
នយោជិកនៅ
organized
តែ
in
ប្រើកិច្ចស
2005.
ន្យាខ្លីក្នុងការយកលេសនៅ
So
ពេលដែលគាត់ចងក្រងសហ
the
ជីពហើយគាត់
worker,
បានយកទៅ
yeah,
សហជីព
work for
បើ
10
យកលេសដាក់ដល់
years,
កិច្ចសន្យាហើយ
but
គេមិនបានរើសអើងសហជីពទេគេ
yeah, they
បញ្ឈប់
continue
ដោយ
to
សារគាត់
use
មិនបន្ត contract
short-term
ហ្នឹង
contract, and then
ដោយ
when
ឡែកតែក្រសួង
they
ការងារគាត់ក៏យល់
organize,
ឃើញថាការមិនបន្ត
workers
សន្យាការងារ
are
គឺជា
terminated,
ហេតុផលមួយ
and
ដែល
they say
ស្របតាម
that
ច្បាប់
it's
ប៉ុន្
not
តែយើងមើលឃើញកន្លែង
kind
មួយវិញ
of
ការមាន
like
ការ
union
ពីមិនផ្សព្វ
discrimination,
ផ្សាយ
but
កិច្ច
it's
ការងារ
expiration
ក្នុងប្រទេសកម្
of
ពុជានិយាយថា
contract.
មិនឲ្យយកលេស
And
ក្នុងការមិនបន្ត
yeah,
កិច្ចសន្យាការងារ
but Article
ដោយពេលដែលកម្ម
12,
ករចូលស្ដីពីគេ
yeah, of
តែយើង
the
កន្លែងមើលអត់មាន
labor
ហេតុផល
law
ទាំងអស់
say that
ពី
there
ការមក
should
10
be
ឆ្នាំមកដែលមាន
no
ការព្រមាន ហើយដែល
discrimination
ដែលឈប់
of
អត់ច្បាប់អត់
based
ស្អី
on
ក៏
the
អត់ដែលមានបញ្ហាទាំងអស់
union
គេឈប់
affiliation
អត់
and
ធ្វើ
so
សហជីព
on.
ហើយបានគាត់
But
បញ្ឈប់
yeah,
ជាងនឹងទៅទៀត
the point is
មន្ត្រី
so
ក្រសួងការ
evident
ងារ
because
បានចូល
workers
តាម
work
សួរ
for
ជាង
over 10 years, no
ជាមួយ
mistake at
នឹង
all.
ម្យ៉ាង
But
ទៀត
as soon
ហើ
as
យ
they join the
យកផ្នែ
union,
ក
they
ខា
are
ងមួយផ្នែកមួយ
terminated.
ខាង
And the
ហើយរុញឲ្យ
ministry
កម្មករហ្នឹង
just close one eyes
ដែល
and
ទៅបន្តទៅ
just
តុលាការ
push
ទៅ
the
អីទៅ
case
ហើយយើងដឹងហើយមន្ត្រីគូនៅ
for
តុលា
the
ការរបស់ប្រទេសកម្
workers
ពុជា
to file the case
មាន
to
ពេល
the
វេលា
court.
យូររាប់
And
សិបឆ្នាំ
as
ហើ
we
យពេល
know,
ដែលកម្មករហ្នឹងមិនអាច
it is
ទទួល
very
បាន
widely known
យុត្តិ
that
ធម៌សម្រាប់ពួកគាត់ទេ
the court in Cambodia tend to
ហើយ
be kind of the process is
brand
lengthy
ជាទូទៅ
and
ខ្ញុំក៏ធ្លាប់
rarely
បានសរសេរ
workers
ទៅ
could
ដែរ brand មួយ
get
ចំនួន
the
ខ្ញុំនិយាយថាគឺមាន
justice
ទាំង
from
ម្
that.
ចាស់
And
មាន
brand,
ទាំង
we also wrote
brand
to
ជ
some
ប៉ុន
of them,
ដូចជា
including
Lacoste ដូច
Adidas,
ជា
including
Lockheed
Japanese
Mark
brand,
Puma របស់អីហ្នឹងគឺ
Lacoste, Puma, and
Nike
so
ហ្នឹង
on,
យើងធ្លាប់សរសេរគេ
Nike,
ថា
and
គេ
so
អ
on.
ត់មាន
We
ការខ្វះ
wrote to
ខាត
them
ពី
as
យុត្តិធ
well,
ម៌
and some
ជា
of
ពិ
them
សេស
don't even reply to us.
បច្ចុប្បន្ន
And
នេះគឺ
especially now,
គេកាន់តែ
they
ទៀតពួក
even
យើងទៀត
uh,
ជាពិសេស
impose
ការចង
more
ក្រងសហជីព
restriction on
អញ្
against
ចឹង
us,
ដូចយើង
especially
និ
in
យាយទៅ
terms of
រោងចក្រ
union
ដែលអត់ស្របច្បាប់
organizing. And as
អត់
we
មាន
know,
អីដែលជួយបានទេ
union, I
ទោះ
mean,
បី
a
ប្រទេសកម្ពុជា
factory,
មាន
if they
គម្រោ
don't
ងបះ
comply
ទៅ
with
រក
the
ក៏
law,
ដោយ
there is
ដែលមាន
nothing
គម្រោង
to
ILO គម្រោង
to
រោង
do.
ចក្រថែរ
I
ក្សា
mean, to
BAC
correct
ប៉ុន្តែ
that.
យើងនៅ
Although
ឃើញ
we
របាយ
have
ការណ៍
the
របស់ BAC
better
ហើយយើង
factory,
មើលចេញរបាយការណ៍របស់
Cambodia or
ខ្លួន
BFC,
ហើយ
uh,
ឆ្លង
uh,
កាត់ទៅរដ្ឋាភិបាល
they
ដូចគ្នា
have the
អញ្
report,
ចឹង
yeah,
នៅពេលដែល
but
រោងចក្រ
before they
ថា
issue
ខុស
the
យើង
report,
យើងចេញរបាយការ
they
ណ៍ថារោងចក្រ
also
ហ្នឹងខុស
get
ហើយ
through
មានកា
the
របញ្ឈប់
government
មេដឹកនាំ
approval. I mean, it's kind of like they
អឺ
get the
ទោះបីយើងមើលឃើញថា
to
អូ
the
ក្រសួងការ
government
ងារដូចជា
before
ឲ្យ
they
មាន
are
5 ឆ្នាំឲ្យយកចូលដី
they
រោ
are
ងចក្រអ
released.
ត់អនុវត្ត
So
យកលុយ
yeah,
មកដាក់ទៅចូលវិញ
even
ដៃលុយ
yeah,
ក៏អត់បានយក
the
ទេក្រសួង
case
ការងារក៏ថា
of
អាហ្នឹងអត់បញ្ជាយកចូលឬមិន
even
យក
the
ចូលវា
case
រឿង
of
របស់គេ
termination
ដែល
of
ចង់ឲ្យយក
union
ចូលយកទៅ
leaders,
ដាក់ពាក្យទៅតុលា
and
ការ
then
ទៅ
there
រួច
is
ទៅបាន refer
the
ទៅជា
decision
ព័ត៌
from
មានមួយ
arbitration
មួយ
council to
អញ្ចឹង
reinstate the
ទាំងកន្
dismissed
លងមកក៏
workers.
យើងមាន
But
ការធ្វើ
yeah,
ការធ្វើការ
there is the decision, but then
ធ្វើការកម្មករដូចជាដីនាការ
the
មួយរយៈពេលនៅលើសង្
ministry
កត់ក៏មាន
say,
ការ
okay,
គម្រោងដំណើរការ
you
ពុ
file
ក
a complaint to
ពុ
the
កម្នេញ
court, and
ដែល
then
លើការធ្វើសវ
finally,
កម្ម
although
ផ្អី
with
ទៅហើយ
that
គាត់ទៅ
we don't get it.
ស៊ើបអង្កេ
And
តទៀត
in the
ហើ
case
យ
of
អង្គការមួយចំនួ
Nagavel
នក៏ត្រូវបាន
and
អឺ
the
ត្រឡប់ទៅវិញ
organization
ដោយសារ
called
ការធ្វើ
Central,
ទុកបុកម្នេញ
there
ជា
is
ពិសេសការ
still no
អឺ
solution,
បង់ព
and
ន្ធ
there is also
ជាពិសេសការ
persecution
សម្ដែង
among
កាត់បង់ពន្ធកន្លងមកមានកា
you
រប
know
ង់ពន្ធដែ
the
រដោយសារតែ
government
សារមានការ
kind of
អំ
like
ពើ
cause trouble
អឺ
for
មួយចំនួនគាត់ទៅចាក់ចងចាប់អីចឹង
some
ទៅធ្វើឲ្យ
NGOs due to
មួយចំ
I
នួ
mean they
ន
use
នៅពេលដែលគេចង់ធ្វើបាប
their
ស្ថាប័
excuse
នទី
is
1 ដែល
in
យកគេទៅ
relation
យកលើខ្លួនទី 2
to
គឺការមិនចុះ
taxation
បញ្ជីពន្ធដារ
and
ដែលច្បាប់អត់ទាន់បាន
taxation
អឺ
and
សហជីពអីអត់
which
ទាន់បាន
is
តម្រូវឲ្យ
still
ចុះថាទៅចុះឈ្មោះតែនៅពេលដែល
kind
គេ
of
យក
like
លេសមានការធ្វើបាបសហជីពគឺគេឲ្យយើងទៅចុះពន្ធដារកន្លងមកយើងអត់បានចុះព
many
ន្ធដា
of
រទោះ
the
តែធ្វើទុកបុកម្នេញ
union have
គាត់
not
មានវិន័យ
registered for
រាប់
taxation, and
រាប់ពា
then
ន់ដុល្លារ
so they operate like that. But if the government want to cause trouble for a specific organization, they will just bring this issue up and impose kind of like high fine and impose a fine as well as possible punishment to many years of imprisonment. And some of the leaders had to kind of like flee the country and so on. So recently, it's very difficult, and also the support for Cambodia from, for example, USAID is kind of like terminated. We lose majority of it, and so activities of the NGO as well as union has been reduced as well. Pisal, if you have anything else you want to add, please just ask Pisal. Okay, she speak, but we cannot hear her yet.
Vậy mới xả liền.
I don't have anything else to add, but if you want to ask me specifically about the case of Hulu, I can answer. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think important to remember, I mean, with the name of the series about uncertain times, right? The instability that we're feeling here, that we heard reference in terms of the USAID cuts, right? Like people are feeling that everywhere right now. And a lot of the instability that we're feeling here is creating waves and ripples in other places across the globe. And with that, I just want to open it up to our panelists. Just to see if anyone wants to share any last thoughts before we close out our conversation today.
Yeah. I'll just reiterate really briefly one thing that I think a number of the other panelists said, and that is that we need to shift the power back to the workers, and that there should be more of a worker-centric or worker-driven reporting system in this audit system, if it still exists as the way as it does currently. And that's about it. Bring the power back to the workers.
Thank you, bro. I actually think that's a really good place for us to end today's conversation and webinar. And with that, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Special thank you to our panelists. Some who have joined us quite late in their evenings. Today's conversation underscores the extent to which social auditing firms and corporate social responsibility schemes are doing more to protect companies' reputations than they are protecting workers' human rights. But we also see that even as civil society and human rights are under attack here in the US and in countries around the globe, organized workers continue to be the strongest, best advocates for their own rights. And despite or even because of the billions of dollars every year that go to the social auditing industry, low-wage workers and global supply chains continue to rely on campaigners and the support of civil society organizations around the globe to pressure corporations and win what they are legally owed. In our last webinar in this series, we did a campaign on Fruit of the Loom and the vital importance of legally binding, enforceable agreements to protect worker rights. We have been supporting innovative worker-led campaigns to win such protections for decades now, and at Partners for Dignity and Rights, we'll continue to keep the pressure on corporations and uplift workers' demands. I hope that you all can sign up for the email list in the chat. And we hope to see and talk to many of you soon. We'll be taking a brief summer break in the series and then announcing the next webinar to take place in early September. I hope you can join us then. And once again, thank you for everyone for joining us. And yeah, thank you.